Right, good afternoon everybody. It is just afternoon. We're going to make a start because time is tight and we've got quite a lot we want to get through, but more importantly we want to allow a lot of time for questions for people to explore what focal ministry might mean and how we're taking it forward in the diocese. So my name's Mark Wigglesworth. I'm a member of the parish support team and I'm one of the people who's been helping to form and think about what focal ministry might look like in the diocese. And I'm joined, I'm pleased to say, by Peter Rainford. Peter is a reader and he is and has been a focal minister even before we had the name focal ministry in Kimberworth Park, and he's going to contribute some of the talk so you get a change of voices. There will be a slight hiccup when we change over because it's all being videoed and I've got a microphone on which I want to pass on to Peter, but let's see where we're going. So we're going to have some introductions, which is what we're just doing now. I'm going to talk for about 5 minutes about what is focal ministry, then hand over to Peter, who's going to do about 5 minutes each on why we're doing it in the diocese, who can do it, and then I'll pick up again with how can we do it and some of the, just an introduction to some of the thoughts and ideas we've begun to develop as we take it forward as a diocese. And then, as I say, I'm hoping that there'll be a good 15-20 minutes at the end for a conversation, for your questions to explore, and that allows us to fill in the gaps that we haven't perhaps had time to explore in detail later on. So, introduction done. What is focal ministry? Well, the first thing to say is it's not a new idea, though it may be a new term. Something to help us get to grips with the changes we've been going through. The 2012 strategy document, which I still have a copy of in my bag and on the desk, had this diagram as it encouraged us as a diocese to think about working in mission partnerships. In the top right-hand corner, it talks about teams of lay leaders in each church. Every local church will have its own ministry team of licensed and authorised ministers under the leadership of the stipendiary incumbent, enabling the whole body of Christ. That is focal ministry, and that was 2011-2012. That same diagram was repictured, represented with slightly different words in the consultation document that went out in the summer. So that's focal ministry. It's a response to a wider challenge, a challenge that's being faced across the Church of England. The report From Anecdote to Evidence suggested that where you've got several churches with one leader, they were less likely to grow than one church, one leader. I was peripherally involved in that research and recognised that as a diocese, even back in 2014, we had quite a number of parishes where we had one leader and several churches. How were we as parish support team, how was I going to help them to grow? And so I had the blessing of a sabbatical in 2017 and went and visited a number of dioceses because I knew from the research that there are multi-church benefices with one ordained leader that are growing. What were they doing? What can we learn from them? And my conclusion was that where there was some delegated authority in each of the churches, leadership in those churches, not necessarily stipended, not necessarily ordained, but leadership for each of those church communities, they were much more likely to grow and they could thrive and grow. Focal ministry. What is a focal ministry? Well, a leader in mission. The face of the church, the go-to person. Somebody who's there for church members and for the wider community. That term focal ministry was debated quite a lot. Bob Jackson, former vicar of Grenoside and church growth consultant, helped to coin that phrase. I remember actually sitting in his living room talking to him about it as we explored it together. He said the problem with calling people local ministers is we already have those. in all sorts of forms, in all sorts of places. It describes a whole range of ministries, and he wanted something new, something distinctive to help people begin to think perhaps differently, more imaginatively, and focal minister came to mind. It's a word, focal, that carries a range of possible meanings that can help us to think about it. A focal minister is the focus for members of the church, the person to look to, but also the person to shine a focus, a spotlight on things, a person who acts as a conduit almost from the community to the church, a person who's seeking to lead and guide and provide a focus for the mission of the church. So it's a word that offers and provides direction. I've tried to summarise this in this diagram. It's a bit messy, but the focal minister is at the centre, but the arrows are going all over the place. They're providing the direction, the point to start from, but all the arrows are two-headed. The risk is, for some people, that focal ministry implies everything is focused on that person and that person does everything. That's a misnomer. It's rather like the idea that the vicar is the person who does everything. That's a model that we've tried, and I would suggest we've found to be failing. So it isn't about someone doing everything, but it's about somebody helping others, leading, guiding, being part of the church, the leader in mission and ministry for the church, for the wider community. They can be lay or ordained. They could be voluntary or paid. They can be a reader, a worship leader, a warden. They may have no particular role at this point in the life of the church. An important thing to say about focal ministry is that it's contextual. Each church is different. Just go and visit another church. There will be something that's different. And as you go across the diocese, there is a range of differences, an enormous range. So it's not a one-size-fits-all model that says all focal ministers will do A, B, C, D. You know, at 9:10 on a Sunday, every focal minister will be doing this. It's about an enabling ministry that's appropriate to context, appropriate to the calling of the people, to the calling of the church, to the place where they're working. It's enabling ministry working with others, working with the oversight minister, working with the PCC, the wardens, any authorised ministers in the life of the church. It's a range of tasks and roles. It may be that the focal minister will be somebody who preaches and who leads the services. It may be there's somebody who doesn't but enables others to do it. And in that case, one of the important things that we've recognised is they should still be a visible presence during worship. So maybe the person who welcomes people each Sunday, the person who does the notices. Some of our churches have a different or visiting priest or person preaching and leading the service each week. How do we relate to a different face every week? A focal minister provides that focus, that place to look. So the contexts are different. That's Kirk Bramwith, very small country church, congregation on a good Sunday, 10 or 12. Woodlands, on a good Sunday, possibly 100 people. Messy church, they are led by focal leaders. We haven't yet perhaps called it that. Or maybe a cafe church, or maybe. Each place where we're gathered to worship needs a leader. And those last two remind me that, again, this is something that's been happening already in fresh expressions of church around the country. And those are the places where the church is growing, where it's reaching the places that other churches cannot reach, where there's a passionate, focal sense of direction, where people are brought together, encouraged and working. Focal ministry, drawing together. Bob Jackson, I've already mentioned, did some research and introduced focal ministry in St David's Diocese, and this Grove booklet, which is available on the bookstall to buy, summarises Bob's thinking and research, a culmination really that started when he was here in Sheffield and Grenoside and started to ask questions about why do churches grow and why do they decline. And one of the things he's consistently said, it's about having consistent leadership. Churches struggle when that leadership disappears. So St David's Diocese face much greater challenges than we do. Each of their deaneries is aiming to have 2 stipendiary clergy. But they've still got as many churches as we have, probably more scattered than we have. And Bob, as he talked to them over several years, developed the idea of focal ministry. And he checked it out. Looking at 29 churches that in 2014 had focal ministers, this is a combination of their average Sunday attendance. So the 29 churches between them had 461 people on an average Sunday in 2010. By 2014 it had fallen to 363. After the introduction of focal ministry, they grew to 386, 423 and carried on. They didn't all grow, but most of them did, and across the whole patch they did. And Bob's done similar analysis and had discussions with all these dioceses, and each of those dioceses has at least one church that he spoke to, and the majority of the churches with focal ministers again saw a turnaround from decline to growth. So there's some practicality in terms of a system that seems to work. Right, that's me. Sorry it's such a whistle-stop tour.
Service resumed. Well, why do focal ministry? And perhaps despite some of the things that have been shared already, which perhaps will explain why we're doing it, I think there's probably still a feeling around, with all the other pressures on us, do we have to? And it might be that our stance is one of resigned acceptance. But the signs are clearly that with finances as they are, we don't have the same level of stipendiary ministry available. Indeed, to make the system work, someone calculated that we probably need an increase in our income of around £10 million. We're not going to do that in the near future. So it may be that our response is sort of a resigned acceptance. Well, we've got to do this, we've got to find focal ministers to fill the gap left by clergy. And there is a risk that it can be embraced with a kind of sort of grudging compliance or resigned acceptance. But I'd suggest that if this is the case, if we respond to the challenge of focal ministry in this way, it's not exactly going to deliver a strategy of renewed, released and rejuvenated. But there is another mindset, and that is of a determination to rise to the challenge. Okay, we might not have chosen it, well, to quote perhaps an unlikely example of responding to an extreme situation, Emperor Hirohito on their defeat in the Second World War, he said we must now accept the unacceptable and surmount the unsurmountable. And it may feel at times, as we look at the prospects ahead of us, squaring circles and all that, quarts into pint pots, that we're endeavouring to surmount the insurmountable. But that positive thinking took Japan some way, and may indeed take ours some way. But there is a further response, and we as people of faith, I think, would want to consider this. What's God saying in this? Where is God in this situation? Many sense that God is already pointing us to the gifts that he's given to the church, across the church, to all the baptised membership of the church. And he's reminding us of his call to make those gifts available for his work in the world, and indeed wherever he calls. Traditionally, we've perhaps narrowed the possible callings of God. Non-ordained members have left it to the ordained to take responsibility and provide services in both senses of the word, and we've grown dependent. Ordained members have sometimes implicitly fostered that dependency, but it results in a church which is not realising its potential maturity, fruitfulness, or capacity for action. I'd like to share a quote here which actually comes from around 50 years ago. The laity are not the helpers of the clergy so that the clergy can do their job, but the clergy are helpers of the whole people of God so that the laity can be the church. And this means that the whole relationship between ordained and non-ordained ministers is being re-examined. And we're all in the melting pot at the moment. We're figuring out what does this mean, but we're seeking God's guiding. What's God saying to us in this situation? Certainly opens up new horizons. God's given gifts for ministry to ordained and non-ordained, and indeed he's calling some of us into roles which are entirely new to us. This is true of both clergy and laity. We may feel unworthy, inexperienced or unqualified, but the question is, are we open to God's call to serve where needs would otherwise be unmet? Those of us who are not ordained finding ourselves called to new roles in leadership, which we hadn't been used to, or certainly in the church, or new levels of responsibility. And I think many during periods of clergy vacancies have discovered that sort of step change where we're having to make choices that we could always rely on the vicar to do hitherto. And likewise for the ordained, it may mean more emphasis on that ministry of enabling, of equipping the saints, a new ministry of oversight. I know some clergy feel, well, this wasn't what I originally came to do. But is God challenging us to a new type of ministry, a fine calling, as we read in the first letter to Timothy. So there's a little of why focal ministry. In a sense, we have to. Can we rise to the challenge? But most importantly, what's God saying to us in this? Is this his calling to us? So that's a little on why we're doing it. So to the question, who can do it? Now, looking at St David's Diocese, with a lot of small rural parishes, small congregations, it might well be that one focal minister is entirely appropriate and more are not needed. Maybe. But in our experience in Kimberworth Park, what the sort of model that's emerged here as being more one of working as a team. And speaking personally, I can't see it working in any other way. I think team working here is absolutely essential. And here I quote again, some of you will be familiar with James Lawrence in Growing Leaders. Throughout the New Testament, church leadership is presented as a collective ministry. Growing leadership grows best in community. Christian leadership is not meant to be a solo operation, but a team experience where the gifts of the team complement and balance one another. I would certainly say amen to that, based on our experience, and I'm sure many others here in the room would say the same. So who might be part of this team? Well, it might be people who are ordained or licensed or elected, or it might not be. I mean, in our team, when it was formed, there were 3 of us who were readers, 2 had no formal recognition, but their gifts of leadership were evident to all. But whatever our sort of formal status, the team needs to be identified on the basis of gifts and aptitudes which are needed to take the church forward under God. So I suggest here 5 qualities which we might be looking for as we discern who might be part of a focal ministry team. So people who are mature, able to carry responsibility, and we may find that people have acquired gifts in that area through their working life, Monday to Saturday. People who are motivated by the love of God, not just to be sort of wannabe vicars, it's God's calling. Committed to allowing God to shaping their lives. The word formation has often been applied to clergy, but not to laity. But we all need to be formed, reshaped into the likeness of Christ, and we are open to that. And that'll be a key factor, I think, in identifying those who are ready to be focal leaders. Open to God's leading and vision. And finally, not least, able to work as a team. Now, you may well be thinking, as you look at your congregation, I'm not sure there's anyone who kind of fits that just yet. But I'd suggest it's never too soon to start. And I'd like to share here a model which some of you will be familiar with, which I found tremendously helpful and encouraging, because it recognises that in our churches, as individuals, we're at all sorts of different stages. This is based on Life Shapes, which Mike Green, who's well known in these quarters, has developed. And the 4 stages here, one, if you like, is what perhaps clergy are used to. I do, and hopefully you watch and you see my example. This is how we do it. But then we move on to I do, you help, you get more involved. It's not just me doing it. But then this is the corner around the square, as it were, which I think we probably balk at in our current church culture, is where the person who's the minister in charge there is saying, you do, I help. And that sounds like a gear change. But for focal ministry to work, we have to turn this corner to you do, I help. And then, you do, I watch. There's a ministry of oversight. So, in our churches, we may be in different positions. It may be still in your church that it does have to be an emphasis on I do, you watch. But the important thing is not to get stuck there, to realise that that is just one stage on the way, not an end state. And that what you're working towards is that position of oversight, where the saints are equipped to do the ministry, exercising the leadership that there is there already in the local church.
There's one stage in the south there which is multiplying at the end. They reproduce their ministry, maybe the one before.
Yes, you kind of, and you go around the circle, don't you? You go around the square. Yes, so just doing it in a list, I've missed something important there. Thanks. Yes, so you do, I watch. And then it moves on to, yes, each leader going through the process again, enabling others. Thanks very much. So if you've got a vacancy already, if you're an overworked church warden or something, you may feel, well, I'm into this process already. Where churches already have their own sort of resident minister, it's really important to start this process and developing a culture of team working. I can think of one church in particular with some really talented people. I thought this is surely a church, when it came into vacancy, clergy vacancy, when they'd be able to adopt this sort of ministry. But the vicar went. The vicar kept a fairly tight lid on tensions and so on latent there. They hadn't learned to work together as a team, and all those divisions came out when the vicar left. So developing a team working culture is important through all this. It may be that you say, well, I still don't think we've got anybody available, no one who's willing or able or appropriate, perhaps because of ageing. I mean, and this is a factor which I'm very well aware of from our own church. But if this is the case, I'd suggest this may raise some really hard questions for us. And the first is other issues about priorities and patterns for the church. Our expectations of what the church does. Or it may be questions about sort of discipleship and priorities for individual members. It really focuses the mind, again, on what God is calling us to as churches and individuals. Or the question, might a team or indeed an individual focal minister be brought in from outside, perhaps to help inject new life, new vision, fresh perspectives into the church? Or, and hopefully not, but should the congregation seek to combine with another church? Let's say there's a Methodist church next door but one. Should the two congregations come together to make sure there's still a Christian presence in that community, but working together rather than as two small and viable units? But there may be that really hard question at the end, is if there isn't any potential at all in this church for leadership from within the local community, is the church on the threshold of not being viable? But I hope before that question arises that answers are emerging to some of the earlier ones. When I put this next slide up, I didn't realise what the conclusion of our last session would be, but here goes. Maybe God's saying something to us. Well, we've looked there at the why and the who. I'm going to hand back to Mark, who's going to answer all your questions about how on earth it's going to work, and what about the safeguards, and what about the training, and all the other reasons why it's mission impossible, but we're going to surmount the insurmountable.
Thanks, Peter. So yes, how can we do it? want to outline a basic process for exploring focal ministry that we've begun to develop. It doesn't have all the answers in this bit. I want to leave time for the questions, so I'm going to go through it, but then we can explore them a bit further, and you can ask the questions we haven't answered, and if I can't answer them, there are other people in the room who might. So we've identified a 6-stage process just to help us to make sure we've thought through what might go on. And the first key stage is exploration. Exploration within the life of a church. Is this something that we can do? A chance to begin to think, what might the focal minister do? Or the focal ministry team, that preferred model that Peter spoke about. The risk is that we straight away think, what might Bob do? Or Heidi or Mark or somebody else, and we shape the role around the people, and some of that has to happen, but ideally we want to start with what do we need, and then we look to see where God is filling that need and providing what we need. So exploration, starting to think about it, talking to the PCC, maybe talking to parish support team, area dean, how might this work in our area, what do we need, what's it going to look like? So what will it look like here? Agree a direction of travel and begin to develop an outline role description. What would a focal minister do in this place? And remember, each place is unique. Stage 2, a process of application. Actually speaking to others and saying, we want to go down this route, inviting people. Now you've got a role description and saying, could this be you? Asking people to apply, having conversation, trying to spot the potential leaders and begin to question their calling. Test it out. Pray, of course. And at this stage, as you identify potential ministers, you can start to tweak the role description. And if you've got a big role description and a team, you could say, well, you'll do these bits and you can do these bits and you can do these bits. So you begin to make it a manageable role. And we also invite people to apply and fill in an application form. There needs to be a process of discernment, of listening to God. So the next stage, whizzing through authorization, we're going to have a discernment interview where we need to look at some of the things Peter referenced, at the call that people feel God has given them, that maybe, like Andrew said in the talk before, something that's been there for a long time. Look at the character of the people, look at their competencies, what sorts of levels of training might they need, and begin to identify what those trainings can be. And also look at the chemistry. There are some people who are obvious candidates to say no to, and others who are obvious candidates to say yes to. And that can be a tricky conversation, but it's important to get it right. There'll be an interview with probably the oversight minister, with representatives from the church, but also representatives from the diocese on behalf of the bishop, perhaps from the parish support team or the training team or an archdeacon or area dean, so that it's part of the whole ministry of the people. It isn't just local, it's for all. There'll also be a time for thinking about what training's needed, and we're very conscious that a lot of Anglican training has become very much fill you up with loads of stuff just in case you need it. We want to try and learn from my time in industry years and years ago, where we started to introduce doing stuff just in time. So just in time training. There will be some core things that need to be done before you get started to make sure you're aware of how it might work and responsibilities, and to sing from the same hymn sheet, so to speak. But then other things are introduced as you recognise the need, and it will be delivered in a whole range of ways. It could be the oversight minister using their experience and knowledge who's providing that training. It could be a module from St Peter's College. It could be something else that you find online. It could be a deanery course. Hopefully it will be appropriate to the prior learning of the person, to the place they're at. If we said we're going to do all the training in Goole, a lot of people from Sheffield might not come. Just remember that when we're doing it the other way round. We need to do it where people are in ways that they can respond. And then you begin. There'll be an induction session to set down those basics. There'll be a period of oversight. some sort of authorisation and recognition service, so people know this is our focal ministry team, and they can begin to ask questions and explore. And then you're getting on and doing it. Sorry, I've left the induction session on again there. Sorry, there's a slide I forgot to complete. The key thing about the doing it is that is when you are doing more training. We're all called to be lifelong learners, developing in ministry as appropriate, responding to the call of God. But you've got the support of the oversight minister, you've got the support of the wardens and the PCC. It's something we're doing together. Finally, stage 6 is a period of review. Each year the oversight minister sits down and has a formal review conversation. Every 3 years, and the thought is at the moment that focal ministers will be authorised for a 3-year period, so you're not committing yourself to being there forever. We can say, well, what's God saying now? And if you feel you're coming towards the end, then it's a time to be saying, well, who next? Who's the next person to take round the square, to raise up, to fulfil the role? That's been a rush, but I do want to allow you to ask questions. There will be millions. We haven't necessarily got all the answers. We're still developing all of this as a pilot. Peter's part of that pilot. We've also doing things out at Penistone and also at Furbeck in Lawton Deanery, and we're looking for other places to begin to talk to people, to listen for God's call and see what it's going to look like across the Diocese of Sheffield. So, questions? Toby.
Bob Jackson in his Growth booklet freely admits that pretty much all the research he's done across the diocese are in rural areas. None of them have got a congregation of more than 45. How confident are we that this is a model that's going to work with churches of, say, over 50 in Sheffield, Doncaster, rather than the more urban areas?
We can't be confident about anything, but I would point you, for example, to St Thomas's Church in Crooks and the church here. They are, in fact, churches of churches, and the churches within the churches are often congregations and groupings of 40, 50. At an early stage they were even bigger, of the 100, and most of those churches within the churches are led by lay people, by focal ministers, by another name. So it happens in that case, and it happens in other cases as well, but it's trying to identify who are the right people to be part of that. We have an enormous resource in the diocese. Even if we go down to 75 stipended ordained people, there are over 200 readers. There are 300 people who are serving as wardens. There are 40 or 50 people serving as youth and children's ministers. There are pastoral workers, there are lay evangelists, and there's the rest of the 16,000 people who are part of our churches. And then also, most of our churches are less than 40 people. So how we mixed out, don't know. We have to trust God. But we've got those oversight ministers to equip, to enable, to help people to do what God is calling those churches.
So on that one, the issue of size is important. Whether or not you have a full-time ordained minister there, but churches have to adapt their styles of pastoral oversight when they reach 50, 100, 150 or whatever the threshold. So I think the principle is the same, whether we're talking about focal ministry or the one minister, one parish sort of system. Yeah, we do have to adapt according to size.
Yes.
I think in long time interregnum, the focal of the church tends to be the church wardens, and they represent the church, and within the church, without the church, and the local community. And I see that as taking a big weight off my shoulders. I really do. I think that the support that is going to be there through a focal minister will allow the church warden to do the work that he thinks is there to do, which is probably more than looking after the building, I agree, but he's still there to do the work that he does. But of course the concern is identifying that person, the person that is going to work within that team, and then apportioning the authority, if you wish, between that person who is the focal minister and the church wardens. I'm not quite sure how that works.
I think the key thing that you said, I mean, first of all, yes, it is a question we've got to wrestle with. Authority in some ways remains with the church wardens, but actually in this new model, each oversight minister also has authority, each PCC has authority, so it's about working together. The focal minister may not actually have much authority. What they're called to do is to guide and to lead and to focus and draw through and hopefully take people with them because they're following and being guided rather than being told, thou shalt, thou must, thou wilt. But it's something to explore, and that will be part of our whole training thing, is how we balance the roles. In some places it may be the warden who is also the focal minister. That also raises questions. In other places it's somebody working alongside the warden so that tasks and roles can be shared. I can't remember, Peter, are any of your focal ministers wardens as well?
No, our wardens are very relieved not to be on the team. We have a division of labour which works very well. And I think if we hadn't got some sort of focal ministry system in place, we'd have difficulty in getting wardens because they just have too much to do and their workload would be intolerable. But it's a case of loosening up, redefining roles. I think this is the key to it, not just sort of thinking in terms of how we've always done it, but how we might do it in the new setup. Thank you.
Another question here.
Yeah, this is moving away from the management processes, I guess, to the situation that I'm in. I've been lucky enough to be in a church where we've got a minister there all the time. So every week we have Eucharist. I can see that there are obviously churches where that's not the situation. Going forward in all of this, as the numbers drop, are there any steps in place to make the delivery of sacraments regular and ongoing for churches that may not, that may find themselves that they haven't got an ordained minister? Is it going to be something that they may encounter? They may be having it once every couple of weeks, and I know this does happen sometimes at the moment. Any thoughts about the possibility, for example, of making communion by extension more widely available?
I'll answer the last question first. Bishop Peter's very clear that he doesn't want communion by extension to become the norm.
No.
So we need to look for other ways of solving that problem. And I suggest there are several. One is by thinking about when we have our Eucharistic services. They don't all have to be at 10:30 on a Sunday. Some could be on a Saturday night, some could be midweek. The second is to ask where they might be. Yes, it's nice to have them in our local church, but most churches in the diocese are not too far from another one. And it may be that sometimes you have to travel.
So at that point, though, you start really breaking apart one of the central tenets of the Church of England, which is the parish system.
When the Church of England set up the parish system, most people had communion 3 times a year. So part of it might be how we think about it. Remember also, there are self-supporting ministers, there are retired clergy, there are others who can do it. It doesn't have to be our vicar. So yes, we haven't worked it all out, but there's a whole range of possible solutions. It's certainly being thought about. Mark, do you still want to say something?
Just to say, Mark from Pastoral, just to say, I don't know whether you've just been involved in the consultation exercise. But we just produced a question and answer response document which addresses a lot of the questions you're asking, which aren't specifically about focal ministry, but what you're asking is a byproduct of it.
I think
and so that document's going to be sent out to everyone who sent in a response, but it's going to be available to everyone on the Diocesan website over the next few days. So a lot of specific questions about communion, extended communion, all that sort of stuff will be answered in that document.
Awesome, thanks.
Richard.
In Doncaster Deanery, we've had lots of discussions about this amongst the clergy chapter, and one of the questions people keep saying is in some churches they can't quite at the moment see potential focal ministers, and that's not saying that there won't be, but they can't quite see it at the moment. Is any work going to be done with churches that are kind of overflowing with potential focal ministers to encourage them to support churches that currently can't really see?
Yes. The challenge is that many people, and I had a conversation just this week about somebody who'd been asked to consider serving in a different church, and they weren't able to say yes. I feel, rather like we heard in the previous session, that we are called by God to serve, and sometimes that call might involve a costly sacrifice of saying, yes, this is the church where I've grown up and served as a reader, but God is calling me to help that church next door. And actually there are quite a few churches in the Mission Action Plan this year. We asked the question, would you like to receive a graft? And a surprising number of churches said yes. And that suggests there is a willingness to receive support and help. And you're also right, there are churches perhaps overflowing with ministry, and it may be that some people are quite happy that they're only serving as a reader and preaching once every 2 months or something, but others may well be frustrated. And the challenge to them and to others is to say, as Peter asked, here I am, Lord, how can I serve? Where might I serve? So let's open up the conversations. Let's invite people just to come and try. One suggestion is that if somebody is going to become a focal minister in a different church, that they just go and join the church for a bit and get to know it before they become a focal minister. And if it's not right, then they can say, well, no, but at least they're open. Again.
Could I just say, at a local level, we hope to do that within Doncaster to kind of encourage people to share and things. But would there be anything from, say, parish supports team or the bishops to kind of say to certain churches, hang on a minute, could some of your guys help this local church? Is there going to be any encouragement from above, so to speak?
We're always trying to encourage from above, but people are sometimes a bit deaf, or maybe stubborn, or maybe we're not saying it in the right way. We will continue to encourage, but also the conversation, friend, could you come and help, may be better than a tap on the shoulder to say go. Yes?
I think that's exactly right, but there's also, this is about opportunity, isn't it? And
it is.
There may be people who perceive themselves as sitting in the pews and being done to, and this is their opportunity to become the doers. And so alongside being gracious to accept people from elsewhere, there is a big enablement need for people who actually might be able to do it, but have never thought themselves in that framework.
Absolutely, thank you. That's an important point. As I was reflecting on the time when I was vicar in Asken, one of the things that I tried very hard to do was just to enable and learn to say, because I could do it, but to actually say, no, I won't do it. You come and do it, and go through that square and encourage people and say, well, actually, maybe you could do this. And it might start just by inviting them to read a lesson on a Sunday and build up their confidence. Or it might be because you've spotted that they are the person that everybody comes and talks to. A key part of this, of my passion for focal ministry, is the pastoral challenge. The pastoral challenge, when you have visiting clergy, or even the same vicar, but they only come every other week. How do they notice the pastoral need if they're not there all the time? Focal ministry is one of the places that I think pastoral ministry is vital. And so identifying that pastoral person who notices, who picks up the phone and says, are you all right? Who then calls the oversight minister or whoever to say, could you just? So I think there's a wonderful opportunity for people to be fulfilled into what God has called them to be. But it does need, for many of us, a lot of encouragement, because certainly in the mining villages, the history is saying, not you. You're no good. You don't need any O-levels because you're going down the pit. We'll give you the house. We'll tell you how to look after it. We'll provide the welfare. We'll tell you what to do. You can't. And that's still there, embedded in many folk. And actually we can. With God's help, we can. It's 10:02. Sorry, we've run out of time. Thank you very much. We will be adding stuff. This has been recorded and will be on the website. Parish support team are coming out and visiting deaneries, and always happy to talk to churches. Thank you very much for coming.